In the remote hollows of Appalachia, there are stories no one dared to write down. In 1925, court records from Breathitt County, Kentucky, quietly noted a girl, barely 12 years old, listed not as a child, but as a wife, and soon after, a mother. She was not the only one. Across Appalachia, entire families were built on child brides hidden in plain sight. How could a nation preaching freedom allow such forbidden unions to flourish? Welcome to Hidden Docs. Here we uncover the stories buried in America's darkest corners. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so these hidden files keep reaching you. Tonight, we step into the forgotten valleys of Appalachia, a land where poverty, tradition, and silence created a disturbing legacy. Girls were married before puberty, sometimes to men twice or three times their age. Some were married to relatives. These brides were hidden behind church doors, altered census records, and the complicity of entire communities. This is not folklore. These are stories carved into the dusty pages of court archives, whispered in mountain folklore, and remembered only by the scars they left behind. The Appalachian Mountains in the early 20th century were a world apart. Isolated valleys, one-room schoolhouses, and families bound by tradition created a society where customs could defy both law and morality. In Breathitt County, Kentucky, known to outsiders as Bloody Breathitt for its violent feuds, child brides were not anomalies. They were a pattern, hidden behind the veil of normalcy. One of the earliest recorded cases comes from the Lexington Herald, July 1927, where a marriage notice listed a bride only 13 years old, married to a man nearly 30. No public outrage followed. Instead, it was printed as if nothing unusual had happened. Local folklore even carried whispers of sister wives, young girls taken not only as brides, but as replacements when older women died in childbirth. A chilling case recorded in county archives describes a girl known only as M.E., married in 1925 at the age of 12. The records note her as wife and mother before she turned 14. Her story was not an exception, but a reflection of a cultural silence. Poverty-stricken families often traded daughters in marriage to settle debts, secure land, or strengthen alliances. For many, it was survival disguised as tradition. Churches played their role too. Rural preachers performed these ceremonies without question, citing scripture that a man could take a wife as soon as she could bear children. In practice, that meant some brides were barely entering puberty. For the girls, childhood ended the moment vows were spoken. Folklorist accounts collected in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project include haunting testimonies. One elderly woman from Harlan County recalled, "They married me off before I knew what it meant. I was 13. My husband was near 30. I didn't fight it. We weren't raised to fight it." Behind these stories lies the shadow of inbreeding. In tightly knit communities where families rarely left the valley, marriages often occurred between cousins or uncles and nieces. Generations of unions within the same bloodline produced not only whispered scandals, but also visible deformities, children born with health conditions that were rarely spoken of outside the holler. Yet in public, silence reigned. Newspapers that printed notices rarely questioned the age gap. Census takers, often locals themselves, would alter a girl's age upward to conceal the truth. Entire communities became complicit in hiding what we would now call abuse, but what they accepted as custom. By the late 1920s, Kentucky was known for high rates of underage marriages, yet the state did little to intervene. It would take nearly a century before Kentucky began to tighten its laws, finally closing loopholes that allowed marriages at ages as low as 12, with parental consent. For the girls of Appalachia, though, change came too late. Their childhoods had already been traded for survival, secrecy, and silence. In the steep ridges of Appalachia, isolation was more than geography. It was destiny. By the early 1900s, communities in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia were worlds away from the cities shaping modern America. Roads were dirt, schools scarce, and medicine nearly absent. Families depended on themselves, their land, and their neighbors. In that closed circle, traditions hardened into laws stronger than those written in Frankfort, Nashville, or Richmond. One of those traditions was child marriage. Poverty sat at the heart of many Appalachian unions. A family struggling to feed 8 or 10 children often saw a daughter not as a burden, but as a bargaining chip. Giving her away in marriage, sometimes as young as 12, meant one less mouth to feed and in some cases a dowry in return. Land disputes, debts, or simple survival often sealed the fates of these girls long before they reached womanhood. Court records from Breathitt and Clay counties, Kentucky 1900-1940, revealed dozens of marriages involving brides aged 12 to 14. These were not rare mistakes, they were repeated patterns. Entire kinship systems were tied together by marriages designed to consolidate what little families had. A chilling entry from the 1910 U.S. Census lists a wife, age 13 in Perry County, Kentucky, married to a coal miner nearly 25 years her senior. These cases often went unchallenged because everyone from census takers to county clerks knew it was just the way things were. Geographic isolation deepened the practice. Many Appalachian communities were cut off by rugged mountains, with little access to outside influences. Roads to towns could take hours or even days. Schools rarely went past the 6th grade, leaving young girls uneducated about their rights or about alternatives. A girl raised in a holler might never hear that marriage at her age was unusual, let alone illegal in other places. Instead, she grew up hearing her mother's voice say, "I was married at 13 and so was my mother before me." Tradition became a cycle that swallowed each new generation. Religion, too, played a powerful role. In small churches scattered across the valleys, preachers often turned to scripture to justify the marriages. A verse about a wife's duty, a sermon about a girl becoming a woman once she could bear children. These were enough to sanctify what the outside world called abuse. Some congregations even framed early marriage as protection. By marrying off a daughter, families believed they were shielding her from sin or from bearing children outside wedlock. In truth, it bound her into adulthood before she had lived a childhood, the myth of pure blood. Another unspoken reason lay in bloodlines. In Appalachia, where families rarely left their valleys, cousin marriages were common. Entire genealogies folded back on themselves, weaving uncles, nieces, and cousins into tangled family trees. Census surveys and genealogical studies in eastern Kentucky note unusually high rates of consanguinity between 1900 and 1940. Some families even defended it openly. "We keep to our own." An oral testimony collected in the Works Progress Administration interviews, 1930s, explains. For them, pure blood meant loyalty to family. Outsiders were distrusted. Marriages across valleys were rare, and children born of cousin unions were simply absorbed into the silence of the community. But the consequences were undeniable. Doctors in rural Virginia reported cases of congenital deformities and inherited illnesses in families where intermarriage had persisted for generations. These were not publicly linked to inbreeding at the time. Locals called it bad luck or God's will. Science would give the answer decades later. Legally, the situation was even more disturbing. Kentucky law in the early 20th century technically set a minimum marriage age, but with parental consent, girls as young as 12 could marry. Tennessee and Virginia carried similar loopholes. Judges rarely challenged these unions. In many cases, they didn't even appear before a judge. Marriages were officiated by local preachers and simply recorded in the courthouse. The result was a double silence. The law looked away, and the culture justified itself. The most haunting detail is how ordinary these marriages appeared. In the Lexington Herald, July 12, 1927, a notice recorded the union of a 13-year-old bride to a 29-year-old farmer. It wasn't printed as scandal. It was printed as routine nestled between farm reports and church announcements. For the girls themselves, the transition was immediate. One day a child, the next day a wife. In oral histories, many recalled their confusion more than resistance. A 14-year-old bride from Harlan County, interviewed decades later, said, "I didn't cry. I didn't know I could. They told me it was my duty. These girls were never given space to dream of futures. Instead, their names appeared in census ledgers and court files as wives before they could even sign their names with a steady hand. They became mothers before they knew their own bodies. What began as poverty, isolation, and faith transformed into a cycle of silence that bound Appalachia for generations. Families defended it, communities normalized it, and the state enabled it. It is only when we pull apart the layers of census data, dusty courthouse records, and forgotten newspapers that the truth emerges. These were not just isolated tragedies, but an entire cultural system of brides before women. The year was 1932 in Greene County, Tennessee, a place where the Appalachian hills stood tall, yet within their quiet isolation, darker traditions took root. Among them was the story of Mary Magdalene Garland. She wasn't a myth, nor a whispered rumor passed through generations. She was a girl, barely 12 years old, who found herself bound in matrimony before she even knew what womanhood meant. Mary's name first appears in Greene County marriage records, a simple entry in faded ink. It states plainly, Mary M. Garland, age 12, wed to a local farmhand 10 years her senior. No flourish, no warning, just another line in a ledger of history. To the Clarks, it was not unusual. In rural Tennessee, child marriages were as common as crop harvests. For Mary, however, it marked the abrupt theft of her childhood. Neighbors later testified in court records that Mary was small for her age, her body not yet fully developed. Yet she was already burdened with the label of wife. Within a year, she would become pregnant. She wasn't yet 13. And the birth, according to a Greene County court transcript from 1934, nearly killed her. The Tennessee courts did not intervene until years later, when Mary herself was called to testify during a local investigation into improper unions. Standing in front of a panel of men in suits, she recounted what had been forced upon her. Her voice, described in the Knoxville Journal in 1936, was steady but childlike, a chilling reminder of the innocence stripped away. She told them she had been married against her will, pressured by both her parents and her new husband's family. One legal observer at the time noted how the courtroom grew silent as she explained that no one had ever asked her if she wanted this life. Tradition, she said, was the answer given to her. Tradition had demanded her body, her silence, and her future. But Mary's story was not isolated. Her testimony revealed a web of practices stretching across Greene, Hancock, and Cocke counties, where young girls, some as young as 10, were married to older men under the protection of legal loopholes. Tennessee law in the 1930s technically required parental consent for marriages involving minors, but the definition of minor was blurry, and in practice, officials rarely questioned such unions. Mary's courage in speaking publicly made her a pariah in her own community. Neighbors whispered that she was betraying her family's honor. Ministers in local churches reminded their congregations that marriage was sacred regardless of age. Yet beyond Appalachia, newspapers seized upon her story. The Knoxville Journal ran a headline, "Child Bride Speaks Against the Old Ways." The Lexington Herald in Kentucky picked up the case, linking Mary's ordeal to a broader epidemic of underage brides in the Mountain South. What made Mary Magdalene Garland's case so haunting was not just the fact of her marriage, but the reaction to it. Many in Greene County saw nothing unusual about her circumstances. To them, her suffering was simply the price of preserving tradition, of keeping family lines intact, of binding two struggling households together. For Mary, however, that price was unbearable. She bore 2 children before the age of 16, and by the time she was 18, she had the weary look of a woman twice her age. Her testimony would later contribute to mounting pressure in Tennessee to revise marriage statutes, though true reform would not come until decades later. Her story sits at the center of America's forgotten files, a reminder that child brides were not only the stuff of distant history or foreign lands. They lived and suffered in the Appalachian heartland. In plain sight, their voices often erased. Mary's courage carved a space for those voices to echo, however faintly, into our present. And yet, the records leave us with an unanswered question. How many others never spoke, never testified, and never lived to tell the world what was done to them? When we step back and examine the broader picture, Mary Magdalene Garland's story was not an exception. It was part of a carefully maintained silence, a culture of concealment that stretched across generations. In the Appalachian South, where faith and family reigned supreme, secrecy became the foundation that allowed these practices to endure. Churches often played the most crucial role. Ministers, bound by their communities as much as by scripture, were known to marry underage girls in quiet ceremonies. Rarely were marriage bans published, and in many cases the records themselves were vague or altered. A girl who was only 12 might suddenly appear in church ledgers as 16. This practice, noted in multiple county histories from Breathitt, Greene and Perry counties, reveals the complicity of religious institutions in normalizing what should have been a scandal. Census takers, too, were part of the silence. The U.S. Census records from 1900 to 1940 show striking patterns. Young wives listed at ages 14 or 15, with a husband often 10 or 15 years older. But look closer, and you see inconsistencies. Some families admitted the child's true age, while others nudged it upward to avoid suspicion. A 1920 census entry from Clay County, Kentucky, lists a wife aged 18. Later school records prove she was only 13 at the time. These quiet adjustments kept families safe from legal scrutiny, while ensuring that tradition continued uninterrupted. Newspapers, too, looked away. The Lexington Herald in the 1920s occasionally published reports on child marriages in Appalachia, but the details were always softened, almost sanitized. Terms like young bride or early union masked the brutal reality. The Knoxville Journal, while covering Mary Magdalene Garland's testimony, never printed her exact age at marriage, just that she was barely grown. In this selective reporting, the horror was buried under polite language. For decades, this concealment shielded entire communities from outside interference. What might shock an urban reader in New York or Chicago was simply dismissed as mountain ways. And so, generation after generation, the cycle repeated. Girls became brides, then mothers, then grandmothers, often still carrying the scars of a girlhood lost. It wasn't until journalists began pulling at these threads that the silence cracked. Nicholas Kristof, best known for his work exposing child marriage abroad, pointed out in early 2000s columns that America itself harbored the same secret. His research revealed that states like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia had marriage loopholes so wide they could swallow centuries of suffering. In one interview, Kristof wrote, "We look abroad for stories of child brides, but too often we ignore the children given away in our own backyards." The legal system lagged shamefully behind. Kentucky, the very heart of Appalachia, did not fully ban child marriage until 2018. For nearly 2 centuries, loopholes allowed minors as young as 13 or 14 to wed with parental consent, or worse, with only a judge's signature. The irony was staggering. The same state that once crowned itself the birthplace of modern democracy allowed children to be sold into matrimony in the name of tradition. By then, the damage had already been written into generations of lives. Silence became inheritance. Families who once hid their daughters' ages taught their granddaughters to do the same. Churches that sanctified child brides went on blessing new unions, and every official ledger, every doctored census line, was a brick in a wall of denial that took nearly a century to dismantle. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: even when the laws finally changed, the silence did not. Many families still refuse to speak about the girls lost to this hidden history. Their stories remain scattered in fragile court transcripts, faded newspapers, and whispered recollections. The past is still buried under Appalachian soil, waiting for someone willing to dig it up. By the time the 21st century arrived, the silence surrounding child brides in Appalachia had begun to fracture. What had once been treated as a family matter, buried in church ledgers and whispered through mountain hollows, was finally dragged into the open by survivors and reformers. For the first time, a practice defended as tradition faced the cold light of modern law. One of the earliest cracks came not from the mountains themselves, but from the state houses. Legal advocates began questioning how Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, states that prided themselves on heritage, could still allow girls scarcely past puberty to be married off. In 2016, a report from the Tahirih Justice Center revealed a staggering number. More than 200,000 minors had been legally married in the United States since 2000, many of them in Appalachia. This revelation jolted lawmakers who could no longer claim ignorance. Then came the testimonies. Women who had once been silenced by shame began to speak. In Frankfort, Kentucky's capital, survivors stood before legislators and told stories that sounded ripped from another century. One woman, married at 13 to a man nearly twice her age, described giving birth at 14 while her friends were still in middle school. Another recounted how a local judge signed off on her marriage to protect family honor after she was assaulted. Their voices cut through the polite evasions that had long protected the system. Journalists amplified these voices. The Lexington Herald leader, once guilty of softening the truth, now printed exposés with headlines that could no longer be ignored. Married at 13 Kentucky's child brides. National outlets followed, drawing attention to what Nicholas Kristof had warned years before, that America's dark secret was hiding in plain sight. The pressure worked. In 2018, Kentucky passed Senate Bill 48, finally closing the loopholes that had permitted children as young as 13 or 14 to marry with little oversight. The law now required all individuals to be at least 17, with strict judicial review even then. For the first time in 2 centuries, the state most associated with hidden child brides officially said, "No more." But victory came with a bitter aftertaste. Reformers admitted that thousands of lives had already been lost to a cycle of coerced unions, poverty, and generational trauma. Laws changed on paper, but healing would take far longer. Families still hesitated to speak about the early marriages hidden in their genealogies. Churches still avoided accountability for the unions they blessed. In some hollows, the silence lived on, and yet there was a sense of reckoning. For the first time, history itself was on trial. The practice that had been normalized in Breathitt County, celebrated in Greene County, and concealed by census takers across Appalachia, now stood condemned by law and memory alike. The chains of tradition were breaking, not all at once, but link by link. The haunting truth remains. While Kentucky's reform made headlines, it was only the beginning. The other states still clung to loopholes, and families in hidden corners continued to guard their secrets. The story of America's forbidden brides was not entirely over. It had simply entered a new chapter, one in which silence was no longer enough to shield the past. And in that unfinished ending lies the most unsettling question of all. How many more stories are still buried, waiting for someone to dig them out of the shadows? The story of America's forbidden brides doesn't end in the dust of the 1920s or the quiet hollows of the Appalachians. It lingers, a shadow stretching into the modern age. For centuries, girls were silenced by poverty, by custom, by the weight of family honor. Their stories were erased, rewritten, or buried beneath census records that claimed they were older than they were. But silence does not erase truth. Even today, the ghost of these practices haunts the nation. In 2018, Kentucky finally passed a law raising the minimum marriage age to 17, after decades of advocacy from survivors and activists. Before that, loopholes allowed judges to approve marriages involving children as young as 13, echoing the same justifications once heard in Greene County or Breathitt County a century earlier. The cycle of silence persisted because confronting it meant confronting the very foundation of family, faith and identity in rural America. For the girls who were taken as brides before they were even women, there is no simple resolution. Some lived entire lives defined by secrecy and shame. Others spoke out, leaving fragile records in court transcripts and newspaper clippings, small cracks in the wall of silence. Mary Magdalene Garland's testimony still echoes, not only as her story, but as a symbol of countless others who never had the chance to speak. The legacy of child marriage in America is not just a story of the past. It is a mirror, a reminder that silence and tradition can be as dangerous as violence itself. And when families choose bloodlines, reputation, or secrecy over the lives of their daughters, the cost is measured not in years, but in generations lost. This is not simply history. It is a hidden file of America's darkest truths, and it demands to be remembered. Welcome to Hidden Docs. Here, we uncover the stories buried in America's darkest corners. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so these hidden files keep reaching you.